The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, a game that changed the world in a lot of ways since it revolutionized the open world concept in video games. However, while it did a lot of amazing things in the end, there are also a couple of things that weren't, great? Well, in my opinion at least. But since a sequel to this insane game is coming sometime soon, it could be that they will improve certain elements that people criticized. And the one I want to talk about today is the boss fight scene in the game. Because while some are really fun, there are also a couple of them that disappointed many. So let's dive into all of this to find out what could change in the very next game. Now, the bosses in Breath of the Wild can be put in two different categories. And it all depends on where you actually find them. In the open world, where you can find them almost anywhere, or inside the corrupted beasts. The ones who fall in the first box are some sort of mini-bosses that are spread throughout the world of Hyrule and just drop incredibly good loot, all while being a fun activity for the player when exploring the huge world. One of the first you ever encounter is the stone TALUS, which is a huge cluster of boulders at first, but once you get close, they assemble into a large golem-like being. There are a bunch of different types of them, like Luminous, Rare, Frost, and Igneo, with their strategy always being the same. They're huge and try to hit you with their body, launch rocks at you, and are quite slow but deal a lot of damage. And you can take them out by destroying the large ore vein on their back. Overall, a pretty fun fight, which can be challenging depending on the type. Another one that we find in the open world is the Hinox, a huge bokoblin-like beast with a single eye who usually sleeps. They will use physical attacks such as swipes and punches and pull up nearby trees in order to toss them at you. And you deal damage to them by just attacking anywhere, although their eye is a weak spot. But if you hit them too often there, then they will try to defend it by shielding it with their hands. Again, a pretty fun fight that offers something completely different compared to the last one I mentioned. And for our last outdoor boss, we have the Moldugas, a giant sand monster that can be found in the Gerudo Desert. They lurk below the sand, patrolling their territory in search of prey, and once they notice something, they will barrel towards it and attempt to ram into it. Now you defeat this beast by using bombs and letting them explode as soon as they go for them, giving you the chance to strike. Again, very different from the last. To be honest, all of them are exciting, new, and unique compared to each other. But now we get to the problem. The ones found inside of the divine beasts weren't that fun. All of them looked the same, but just had slightly different abilities based on the divine beast's gimmick, making them quite boring at times and certainly not as memorable. And when it comes to the final boss, the first round was quite fun. However, the second one was terrible, to be honest. So will the sequel improve on them as well as the overworld bosses? Well, let's look into the possibilities, because in the trailer we do see some interesting things. Let's start with the most obvious one. Ganon. In the trailer we can see that Link as well as Zelda go into some sort of underground cave network in order to find the source of the malice. Eventually they find it, and the place where it comes from is actually Ganondorf's dried out body that's sort of sealed and held in place. Now, as you can imagine, we will end up fighting them at some point. However, in what kind of form? Well, either dried up or somehow restored to his full power again. Or both. For example, if he gets his hands on an artifact like the triforce, or at least one of its pieces, he could come back in his old form, or something even stronger than that. Another option is that he regains the power that was taken away from him when he got locked up. This would also bring him back to his former level of power. So what would the fight look like then? Well, if a dried up version would attack us, then he would most likely not use melee attacks that much. His body is fragile to an extent after all, so that would be a risky move, to be honest. So his only option at that point is some sort of ranged attack strategy. He could, for example, wrap himself in the malice that comes from his body and use it to defend himself and also attack in some way. It would be similar to what Aang does here in Avatar: The Last Airbender, creating some sort of vortex that he's on top of and can use to shoot from, but it's made from malice instead of just wind. However, while that would be cool, there's another thing he could do, which we kind of saw in the first Breath of the Wild as well, using the malice to form his own body. And again, I will be using Avatar: The Last Airbender as an example, because in that show, Aang does a similar thing with water, turning himself into a huge beast by controlling the water creature. This way you could turn into some sort of crazy monster that can attack you in a lot of different ways, as well as use malice as a weapon of sorts. But what would happen if he was restored to his old form? Or something even more powerful than that? Well, he could still use malice-based attacks, like creating monsters, shooting it like some sort of energy ball, and more. However, now that his body is big and strong again, he can also use melee attacks, which would be similar to the stuff we saw in Skyward Sword when we took on Demise, and also during the last stage of the fight with Ganondorf in Twilight Princess. We even see drawings on the walls of the cave from the trailer that show off some sort of buff-looking warrior Ganondorf, and if he gets his hands on some sort of powerful artifact, he could always turn into his pig form known as Ganon, which can take on many different forms. Just compare the one from Ocarina of Time, which is more of a beast with weapons, to what we see in the Wind Waker, which is a puppet thing. So it can be anything, knowing Nintendo, but this is what I expect, or can think of at least. But what about all the others, like the Blights and overworld bosses? Well, when it comes to those, we will see some of them return. Well, most likely at least. Nintendo said the following after all. The idea of creating a direct sequel came from the fact that Eiji Aonuma, producer of Breath of the Wild, wanted to revisit the same Hyrule while incorporating a new story and gameplay mechanics. So I bet stuff like Hinoxes and Stone Taluses will return, but they will need something new in order to keep it all fresh. And I have one idea of what Nintendo could do, which they also hinted at a little bit. Well, in my opinion. Because in the trailer we see malice coming from Ganondorf's body, and even a flash of it shooting up and away from him. So it could be that in the sequel this malice will be seen in the land, and might even play a bigger role. Zelda does say the following at the end of the game after all.
We'll make our way to Zora's domain. Divine Beast Faruta. Looks like it's stopped working. Let's investigate the situation.
Clearly things are still going wrong even though Calamity Ganon was beaten, and Nintendo did say this was going to be a Dark Zelda game. So what I think will happen to the overworld bosses and any new ones we encounter in temples is that they are normal creatures or bosses that are powered up by the malice. And this wouldn't be the first time we have seen stuff like this. Twilight Princess had a similar gimmick going on. In this game you need to collect 2 dark and powerful items. First you're going after the Fused Shadow, and anything that comes into contact with the dark power radiating from it is transformed, which we see in the first 3 dungeons, with the Goron Mines being the best example. Here Darbus, the patriarch of the Gorons, was transformed into Fyrus by this sinister power, and later on, after you finish collecting those, you go on to hunt down fragments of the Mirror of Twilight. Here, a bunch of innocent and also not so innocent creatures came into contact with the artifact and became a lot more powerful and gained completely new forms even. So clearly, powerful dark magic can certainly influence people and creatures, turning them into some sort of living nightmare. And maybe a similar thing could happen in the world of Breath of the Wild. Same beings and monsters, but all of a sudden there is malice that changes them drastically. It would be quite cool and also an easy solution for Nintendo. Remember, it's gonna be like Majora's Mask. It still uses a lot of old stuff but does include some new. So I bet we will also see completely new beings that will come from the underground crypt where Ganon is housed. So as you can see, Nintendo has a surprising amount of options when it comes to making completely new bosses and even reinventing old ones, which would probably result in some cool and unique battles. It did in other games at least, so why not this time? I at least hope they vastly improved the bosses seen in the dungeons of the game, because I was disappointed by those a lot to be honest. However, only time will tell. But Wily, what about the Yiga? They also had a boss fight, remember? Oh snap, you're right. I almost forgot about that. Well, when it comes to Master KOHGA, it could be that he will actually return. Ganondorf is back after all, so maybe he resurrects him and even gives him a boost in power. But that doesn't have to be the case, of course. It could also be that there's a completely new Yiga leader who we have to fight in this game. Maybe he's one of those badass warriors with a wind cleaver but way more powerful. This would also give Nintendo the option to add another sword fighting duel in the game. Maybe it would be somewhat similar to the fight with Monk Mask KOHGA, but updated for Breath of the Wild 2. While also incorporating a lot of the mechanics seen with the Wind Cleaver. I don't know, they could for example do some sort of spin attack, which will obviously damage you if you get close to them, but even if you're far away you can get hit by those cutting winds. That would be quite a cool mechanic to be honest. And now that I think about it, they could also do something like that with a bow-wielding Yiga. In general, they have quite a lot of options. For example, by allowing him to shoot different kinds of arrows, teleport around the place a lot faster than a normal one would, create clones or mirror images of himself, and more. That would be cool. And those are the only two options I can think of. But knowing Nintendo, anything can happen. So, I guess we will see what we take on in the game as soon as it's released. Also, be sure to subscribe, click the bell button, like this video, leave a comment, naughty or nice, and I will see you in the next one.